brewing process. They knew if they didn't have yeast in their wort, it wasn't going to ferment, but they didn't really understand the relationship there, or that yeast was a living organism. And back then, temperature control was not available either. The brewing seasons were mostly in October, right after the harvest, and then during the winter time, it was really too cold to brew and get the fermentations going because the wort would get too cold. So they would stop brewing, January, February, and then they'd break out into brewing again in March. Freeze-rise fermentations were common, again, because of no temperature control. But what brewers did develop over time is running pipes through their fermenting vessels or casks and then running water through there to get some sort of temperature control. And then after the primary fermentation, the beer was always racked into casks. And then what would happen is they'd hold it in the cask or the barrel. And in the summertime, the fermentation would restart. And so that was an important part of the aging process and a reason why a lot of these beers were aged past the summer, because you'd get that final bit of fermentation in the cask in the summertime.
Question?
Yeah, question?
When it was fermenting in the barrel, did they have to worry about exploding barrels?
The question was, did they have to worry about exploding barrels? And the answer is yes. And what the brewers did is sometimes they pull the bung out of the barrel during the summertime as the wort began to heat up and started to work again. So these are the styles I've got that we can talk about. And some of these I've got some good information on, and some of them I don't have a whole lot on. So I'm going to go fairly quickly. Let's see how I'm doing on time. This is a beer. I haven't been able to find any reference to this at all, but Alistair Hook at Meantime Brewery in London told me about this. And he told me that he found some references to a very pale, very hoppy beer that was brewed in the Baltic region in the 13th century. And what they did was, instead of kilning the malt, they allowed it to dry out in the atmosphere, and they called it wind-blown malt. So basically they put the malt out and allowed the dry air to dry it out and kiln it. And so it turned out to be very pale. And apparently this beer was very highly hopped and had a very high alcohol content. So it sounds like some beers we're familiar with today. I haven't been able to find anything on this, and I'm dying to find out a little bit more. But Alistair Hook at Meantime told me about this, and I thought it was pretty cool. There's a beer called Mumm that was brewed in Germany, and it was brewed, it became very popular in London in the 1600s. And it was brewed with wheat, not barley, and sometimes oats and beans. And there are some references to this in the literature, and you can find it. It was not a hop beer, so it was more like a gruit than a beer. But it had a variety of herbs used in it, and there's a listing there of some of the herbs that were used, some of the standard ones. A couple of neat things about this, the literature cites that it was put into a barrel with 10 uncracked eggs. And I'm like, okay, well, what the heck was that all about? Eggs, the protein in eggs are a great fining agent. The albumin in eggs are a great fining agent. But to me, you'd have to, winemakers break eggs into barrels, use egg whites to fine wine all the time. But using an uncracked egg I thought was kind of weird. So maybe it cracks in the beer, and I don't know. Or the beer dissolves the shell and then the protein settles out. I don't know. And then it was aged for 1 or 2 years, and definitely they thought a ship voyage would improve the flavor. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. Here's just an example of stock ale as it was brewed in England. A 1070 to 1080 gravity. And in the United States, I've got another slide on this a little bit later. United States brewers were also brewing Scotch ales. It's interesting, in the United States before Prohibition, there were a ton of really heavily English-inspired breweries, especially in the Northeast, and there's some great stories out there about some of those breweries. Today, stock ale, probably the closest thing today is the old ales, like Thomas Hardy's and Green King's Strong Suffolk Ale. And again, I mentioned this earlier. Stock ales were often held in taverns and used for blending with fresh beer. And Fuller's is still doing some of that. They'll hold some beer back and they'll blend it with some fresh beer and then release it. And if you've ever gone to London, how many people have been to the Fuller's Brewery here? I think, you know, from a historical perspective and also from just being a really classy brewery, I think Fuller's is the most amazing place in England. It's, you know, they really hold on to the traditions, but they're making great beers, and to have fresh Fuller's beer in a Fuller's pub in London is unlike anything else in the world. It's an amazing experience, and if you ever get a chance to go to London, go to the Fuller's Brewery and take the tour. They are holding on to the traditions like nobody else, and it's a very cool thing. Okay, October and March Ale. There's a lot of conflicting information here about what the gravities were on these beers, whether they were really stock ales or whether they were the higher, higher gravity double beer, you know, made by the double mashing kind of thing. But the things that we do know for sure about the October and the March beer is they're brewed with one malt and one hop. Okay, in the October beer, they would take the malt fresh from the harvest and use that malt and a very pale 2-row malt, and then they would use Kent Golding's hops in this beer. And so what you ended up with was a very strong kind of amber gold beer. March Ale versus October Ale. I'm not sure which one was higher in gravity or hopping. You know, there's some conflicting evidence out there. Big thing about these beers is they were aged for several years. If they were bottled, they were aged in the bottle as well. Definitely a secondary fermentation took place in the barrels. Today, the best example of this is J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale, which most people think of as a barley wine, but it is, when they brew this once, and they brew it every year. They brew it in October. They use 100% low-color Maris Otter malt and East Kent Golding's hops. They do a 3.5-hour boil on this beer to get the gravity up, and so their starting gravity is 28 Plato, or 120 specific gravity, and they end up with an alcohol content of 11.5. And those of you that have had J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale, you know that it tastes great when it's aged for several years. So, that is today the best example of an October Ale out there, and I think it may be the only one. So, that's October Ale. Very important beer. It was most of the estate brewers in England were brewing an October Ale. And then Burton Ale, you've probably all heard of this. This was the beer that was the beer of Burton before IPA came along. Very strong, very sweet beer, shipped to Russia and to the Baltics, and then there were some political situations that caused its demise. Basically, the wars with Napoleon kind of blocked the shipping lanes, and then the political relations between Russia and England kind of soured, and Russia started taxing the beer incredibly, anything that was imported into Russia. And so that's what got the Burton brewers to start looking elsewhere for beers to brew, because their whole economy in Burton was based on this beer, and it was starting to fail. A very strong and sweet beer, 6 to 8 pounds hops per quarter of malt, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Often honey or dark malts were added to this beer. Sugars really weren't used in brewing in England until the mid to late 1800s. And the strength, 1083 to 111 specific gravity. One interesting story is the Ballantine Burton Ale, which was brewed here in the United States, and this was a special beer that Ballantine brewed in the 1900s, and they would age it for up to 20 years. And they never sold this beer. They always gave it out to people that sold their beer, important customers, vendors, and things like that. So it was and the brewing employees. So it was a beer that was kept at the brewery, and then they would age it, sometimes for 20 years in wood vats, and then they bottle it and give it out to VIPs, and they never sold it. And Michael Jackson called it a very hoppy barley wine, 10 to 11%. And some good examples of some Burton ales today are the Theakston's Old Peculiar, Young's Winter Warmer, and Fuller's 1845. A very similar beer to the Burton ale was the Scotch ale. And there are people brewing Scotch ales today, of course, but that's a very similar beer. Also referred to as Edinburgh ale or Scotch Burgundy. Again, it's a 25 Plato beer, very strong. And when this was in its heyday in Scotland in the early 1800s and mid-1800s, most of it was shipped to Europe or to the United States. It was, a lot of Scottish immigrants in the United States, and this was a very popular beer style. It was strong, sweet, and dark, and just very similar to what was being brewed in Burton. This is one that a home brewer in London told me about, Majority Ale. And this was a beer that was brewed by Scottish brewers for noble heirs. Youngers was the biggest brewery, and they probably got the best records out there of any brewery in Scotland, historical records. But it was brewed to be very strong upon the birth of a noble, and then it was kept in the barrel until that child reached 21 years old and then opened. And according to this homebrewer, it was James McCrory, if any of you know him, but he told me that the beers were often horrible by the time they were opened. I don't know how we know that, but he brewed one, and I got to taste it, and it was really quite good. It was an amazing beer. So you're starting off with a gravity of 1.14 and finishing with a gravity of 1040, which is 10% sugar. So it's very sweet and very alcoholic. Supreme barley wine, and not sure whether they were brewed with the double brewing process or a 12-hour boil, which I've seen in some literature.
12 hours.
I'm not going to go too much into these because these are beers that are still being brewed today. The Imperial Stout and the barley wine. The most famous early examples were Bass's No. 1 beer, which they no longer make, and also the Courage Imperial Stout, which most people consider the original Imperial Stout, and that hasn't been brewed in almost 20 years. Some of the early Imperial Stouts were brewed with spices and herbs, and we just came out with one that we brewed with anise, because that was a very common ingredient in early Imperial Stouts. Okay, here's a great example, the mild. Remember I talked earlier about a mild being a fresh beer, and here's I've seen examples of milds that were brewed as high as 25 degrees Plato and highly hopped, several pounds per barrels. The only thing is it was served fresh. And I showed this slide here. This is brewed by Dan Paquette at Pretty Things Beer and Ale out in Massachusetts, and he got this recipe from a guy named Ron Pattinson, who writes a great blog, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And this is the recipe, the original recipe sheet, and then this is Dan's label. So it was 10% alcohol, and I got to taste this at the American Craft Beer Fest a year or two ago, and it was really cool. And Dan Paquette's one of those guys that has taken these original recipes and trying to rebrew them, and more power to him. I think it's great. This is another one we came across through social media. I caught wind of this whole thing through Facebook, and somebody who puts a blog on Facebook, and so I started researching it because I thought it might be a good fit for our IPA book. And it's not really an IPA, so I don't know how much is going to be included, but very, very cool beer. Alsop's Arctic Ale. This was originally a beer that was commissioned by Queen Victoria. There was an expedition in 1852 up to the Arctic. They were going to search for John Franklin's lost expedition. They all perished up in the Arctic, and Queen Victoria sent this next expedition up there to find them. And she wanted them to have a beer that was going to nourish them on the trip, and go up to the Arctic. And, scurvy was always an issue, with sailors back in those days, lack of vitamin C and things like that. And so they wanted to brew this really high alcohol beer with a real high sugar content, so it wouldn't freeze, and so it would provide some nourishment to the sailors. And evidently, if you look at Burton breweries in the mid-1800s, they had their own big three. Today we talk about the big three being Bud Miller and Coors. Back in Burton in the day, it was Alsop, Bass, and Salt, and they were all competing to get the commission to brew these beers. And Alsop's ended up winning it. And it turned out to be a very high alcohol beer, very high sugar content, again 10% sugar. And one thing I found in taking a look at this is when they mashed it in, they made their mash so thick that they couldn't lauter the wort out off the grain. And so what they did, the brewers did on this very first batch, is they stuck buckets into the mash and took the wort out and left the grain behind. And they couldn't get the wort to draw through. So